This meeting is being recorded.
And see if there was a way that our church could plug in, if it seemed appropriate, and if there was interest in doing that.
Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. We're going to give folks a few more minutes to pop in here, and then we'll get started. All right, welcome, everyone. Let's give it just another minute, and then we'll get started. All right, well, I think we're all set to get started. So thank you again for joining us this evening for the first session of our series on Afghan history and culture. My name is Zach Whitus. I'm the volunteer coordinator at the Syrian Community Network. And right off the bat, I do want to thank our co-sponsors tonight, namely Girl Forward, Mira, World Relief, Refugee Action Network, and Refugee One. And of course, a special big thank you to the Center for Middle Eastern Studies at the University of Chicago, and our host for this evening, Krishna Kulkarni, who's the outreach coordinator at CMES. It gives me great pleasure to introduce you to Krishna. He and I first met when we were both graduate students together at CMES. I graduated in 2020, he graduated the year before me. And yeah, I consider him a friend and a comrade, and certainly a teacher. So I'm really looking forward to learning alongside all of you this evening. You know, as we as volunteers, community members, professionals get ready to welcome Afghan refugees and parolees into the U.S. in the coming weeks and months. So yeah, without further ado, I'm going to kick it over to Krishna.
Thanks so much, Zach, and I appreciate you reaching out to me to give me this opportunity. It's wonderful to be able to be here with all of you, albeit virtually, and share some of the insights about Afghanistan that I've gained over several years of studying the country's history, working with aid organizations, doing humanitarian aid work in Afghanistan, and for Afghan refugees in the US. So it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you to Syrian Community Network and all the co-sponsors for hosting this program. I hope that it is not only a productive, insightful experience for all of you, but one that easily translates into the volunteer work that you may or may not be doing in the coming months as Afghan refugees, begin getting off military bases and being welcomed into our communities. I also want to introduce Salma Abdul Qadir, who is a current CMES student and also the CMES outreach assistant. She will be kind of a co-host here tonight. She'll be helping out if there are any issues during the event, as well as stimulating, hopefully, your brains with some good questions throughout the evening, and also helping, with the interactive portions later in the workshop. So thank you, Selma, for being here as well. Just a little bit about my background. Zach mentioned, that we were both students at CMES, the Center for Middle Eastern Studies at the University of Chicago. I currently serve as the outreach coordinator there, which involves managing our center's outreach programs to K through 12 schools, to local libraries, to the general public, as well as to national organizations. Our outreach mandate kind of extends to promoting understanding on the Middle East and the world of Islam generally. And so, this really slots right into the kind of work we want to be doing, particularly given how relevant this issue is today. So not to waste much more time, I just want to say, in the past few months, certainly the issue of the US military mission in Afghanistan has been a news item, but also has kind of dropped off of the news radar in significant ways, particularly kind of in the past 2-3 months. So, just to get a sense of who you are, I would love it if, maybe you could type in the chat just a few words about, where you're zooming in from today, why you signed up to attend this webinar and hopefully the ones in the future over the next 3 weeks, as well as, any feelings that were coming up during, really those few weeks at the end of August, early September, when I suppose the issue of Afghanistan and the US military withdrawal from the country was at its peak. Because I think that was certainly a very poignant media moment, but also one that, I imagine might be spurring all of you to action today. So please feel free to just take a moment to, say a few words in the chat. Cool. Please feel free to continue introducing yourselves. It's lovely to see so many people here ready to be engaged. I'm going to start the presentation, but I hope that, kind of throughout the evening, you all are continuing the conversation on the chat. I'm going to try to stick to the slideshow and keep my attention kind of in one place. I'm not the best multitasker, but hopefully, Zach and Selma can also kind of keep that conversation running. So I'm just going to take a moment to get my slideshow up. Can I get a quick thumbs up from you, Zach, that the slides are on? Can you still see the slides, or do you see my planning doc? Okay, great, awesome. All right, I do want to just start, kind of right from the beginning with a very brief content warning. Because we're going to be talking about stereotypes, racism, Islamophobia, some of these really kind of difficult, entrenched issues in our society today. I will be showing some cartoons, images that might be upsetting, certainly ones that indicate or represent harmful or racist stereotypes about other peoples. I don't mean to do that to perpetuate those tropes, but more so to help get our brains thinking about how those tropes operate. If any of that's content is upsetting to you, please just bear that in mind. We will also have a session or a section of the workshop later on where you'll be doing a little bit more of your own media exploration. I've tried to provide content warnings as best as I can to those individual media so you can avoid any that might be triggering. So with that said, today we are going to be talking about the issue of stereotypes, Islamophobia, and how those processes relate to Afghanistan and the unique ways that Afghanistan has been stereotyped throughout history, and certainly today within the US. I was unsure whether to start this workshop series with this workshop or Afghanistan kind of 101, which is going to be next week's session. But I did feel like something that has helped me in approaching issues like this, other places, other people's, has been sort of a media detox, because we live, for better or for worse, in a world that ever more is pushing media to our devices, to our phones, to our computers, to our tablets, whatever it might be, in more and more ways than kind of ever before in human history. So I think that this is hopefully going to give you some tools to just really regulate that information, whether it's being able to identify distorted sources or distorted media coverage, or whether it's reading the news with a lens to those stereotypes so that you can engage critically when you are doing your own research. Because I don't presume to be able to provide you with all the information you're going to need over the next few months in your volunteer work. However, I do want to be able to, kind of teach you to fish on your own, right? To be able to find good information, reliable information, and even when that information is from a reliable source, kind of keep your nose attuned to some of the tropes that proliferate, in our society today about Muslims and about Afghans. So, really, really basic question to start off here. Where is Afghanistan? I think that it's almost it feels almost laughable to start a presentation like this, because many of you probably already know. I'm sure you've looked at world maps before, but I think this question actually has several layers beneath it that are fundamental to how we are going to trace the lineage of a stereotype. Really the life cycle of a stereotype, as I want to call it, from its birth to how it kind of continues to evolve today. So again, not to be too technical, but there are a lot of ways where we can position Afghanistan in the world today. One of the most popular ways is to say that Afghanistan is a South Asian country, meaning that it is naturally grouped with, whether that's culturally, politically, socially, religiously, with the countries of South Asia. That includes Pakistan, that includes India, that includes Bangladesh, that includes Nepal, Bhutan. That may or may not make sense to you, but that's the way that if you go on, the website of a think tank or even of a large, international NGO, they might describe Afghanistan's position in the world. But equally so, you will find Afghanistan mentioned as a country as part of the stands in Central Asia, which include Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan. These are countries in the kind of former Soviet Union in Central Asia. And certainly Afghanistan, while only briefly ever under direct Soviet control, sometimes falls into this category. And of course, we can look back further past the current international system to medieval empires like the Mughal Empire and the Safavid Empire, which in this region, we can kind of look at this map and say, well, Afghanistan doesn't fit neatly really in either of those categories if we take a longer term vision. And then indeed, we even come up with the question of, well, maybe Afghanistan's in the Muslim world. Well, this is a population weighted map of the Islamic world or the world Muslim population. And, I actually often show this map when I'm talking about the Middle East specifically, because people, often associate the Middle East entirely with Islam, or the Middle East and the Islamic world being synonymous. But as we see, some of the world's largest Muslim populations currently exist in Indonesia, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh. These are not countries that we kind of associate all the time with being in the, the Middle East / Muslim world. Why am I saying all this? The mapping of the world into these kind of distinct culturally or socially cohesive regions is not something that kind of came out of nowhere. It's a lasting legacy of decades and decades of really European interactions with the non-European world through European colonialism. These categories might have aided colonial authorities in London and Paris and St. Petersburg in projecting their power across the globe, but ultimately, there are sort of convenient fictions that fall apart when we examine them more closely. And as you can see, categories like the Muslim world, which might feel really, really stable and coherent in our brains when we read the news or watch TV, actually are far more complicated and diverse than they are presented to be. And then, of course, there are new ways of dividing the globe that actually, kind of strengthen those boundaries, that it's not just the cultural and social, limits, or those aren't fuzzy borders, but those are strong borders that determine the way that those regions interact with the rest of the world. I love this map. This is a map of Samuel Huntington's Clash of Civilizations model of the world, where he explains the 21st century's problems through this kind of geographic theory. I think the funniest part is that Greece, with the birthplace of democracy, is not considered part of the the Western world. So even the things that we might think of as so basic, right? I mean, there are all these different ways of carving up the world to kind of make sense of the stereotypes that are already in our brains. And really, that's what this exercise is kind of just intended to bring up, is that a lot of the time these stereotypes live in our brains and we're not even really aware of them until something as obvious as a map can really break them down. So before we kind of launch into the meat and potatoes of Islamophobia, I want to just show this 2-minute video on the concept of Orientalism. And some of you might have heard of this, some of you might not have. It's totally fine, no matter what your background is on this particular term. I think that this is actually a really great video for just quickly explaining it. So I'm going to share this. Hopefully my internet holds up. And let's hope. Here, I'm actually going to bring us to YouTube for this.
From the beginning of
We can't, there you go.
Yeah, I'm gonna reshare the Firefox. Okay, great.
Western
Nobody can hear that, can they? That is too bad. Oh, you can?
Yes, you're good.
Okay, perfect.
From the beginning of Western speculation about the Orient, the one thing the Orient could not do was represent itself. Evidence of the Orient was credible only after it had passed through the refining fire of the Orientalist work. Edward Said, Palestinian intellectual, literary theorist, historian of the colonial narrative. Said explained how colonialism works, not just through armies, but through literature. Not just through conquest, but through anthropology. Not just through oppression, but justified through narrative. He showed how the West painted a picture of the East. Snake charmers, belly dancers, thieves. The exotic, the sensual, the depraved. Said saw it in 19th century Western literature, and you can see it across modern culture. Switch on the news, read the newspapers, look at the images. What stories are you being told? Us versus them. The rational versus the irrational. Civilization versus barbarism. Africans, corrupt despots, starving victims. Latin Americans, drug lords, football players, dictators. Arabs, terrorists, misogynists. Asians, software engineers, religious fanatics. How does it feel to be fixed, captured, framed? Think of Orientalism as a lens. Use it when you read the media. Spot the stereotype, decode the fiction, unlearn the myth.
All right, so hopefully that video doesn't steal my thunder for the rest of the evening, but I do think it's a very well-produced kind of intro to this.
From the beginning of West.
Please feel free if you have any kind of initial reactions to that video, or disagree vehemently with any aspects of it, or learn something you didn't know. Please feel free to throw those comments in the chat as we kind of go on to our next section. Also, I want to pause for any initial questions that people have. Feel free to use the raise hand feature. Okay. Well, onward and upward then. Okay. So kind of now that we have kind of just gotten a very basic sense of where Afghanistan is in the world, but also the various ways that we can kind of categorize it. I want to move on to the issue of Islamophobia. Now, stereotypes about Afghanistan are not entirely stereotypes about Muslims. There are unique and special ways that Afghans are stereotyped, and particularly given the unique experience that Afghanistan has had with outside powers like the British Empire and the United States. However, I think that because of the religious composition of Afghanistan being, upwards of 90% Muslim in terms of population, it is very kind of useful to think about the ways that Islamophobia and Afghanistan, stereotypes about Afghanistan align. So just as kind of a guiding question as we're going through these things, just think about how Islamophobia compares to other forms of bigotry. It's by no means special. There are lots of forms of bigotry out in the world today. Think about maybe the ways that it aligns with one that you yourself experienced or have seen in your community prominently. And also maybe think about why Muslims or the other, as a broad category, are negatively portrayed in media, and particularly US media, given our context. So a few years ago, a previous director of the outreach program at CMES did a educator survey, kind of using this issue of why is there a double standard for Muslims versus other religious groups? Because kind of as we see in this survey from the Public Religion Research Institute, there is clearly a theoretical idea, at least among a lot of Americans, that religious freedom is a core foundation of this country's daily life and the kind of government that we have. And yet, that theoretical standard does not hold true for Muslims. Muslims are seen as uniquely threatening, despite the fact that that their religious expression should maybe fall under the same theoretical framework that the America was founded on, the idea of religious freedom for everyone model takes. So this previous outreach director, was doing a workshop with educators, and he asked, imagine if you're a pollster standing in a shopping mall, what concepts, nouns, and adjectives come to mind when you hear the words Muslim, Islam, Arab, or Middle East? So this was not an actual survey that people took. This was what they think people would say. And you can see that the terms are pretty jarring. That it's beyond racism, right? There is a really kind of there's a hostility to these terms that people believed that their kind of theoretical pollers would talk about Muslims in. This is the second page of these results. And when we think about the way that Islamophobia and any stereotype operates, it goes through its own life cycle, and a lot of it is about information. As we see, the kind of core basis of the life cycle of a stereotype and racism itself is ignorance. That when we live in a world of little to no information or reliable information about somebody else, that can quickly turn kind of into, it can have its own life within our own minds, devoid of any information that is authentic. And I would say that this process is really sped up in today's world because of how much information there is and how difficult it can be to separate out what is reliable, what is real, and not just what's distorting, but what is fake or completely made up. Now, this process started with really an encounter that took place over several centuries, and that was the European encounter with the world outside of Europe. And particularly given the proximity of the Middle East and the Muslim world to Europe, and the huge competitions over these territories, there was a particular interest among Europeans in representing what they called the Orient, right? I mean, as we saw in that video, that colonial encounter was not just a military one, it was an intellectual one, because there was, a belief that the Orient could be understood, and representing it was part of understanding it, or projecting that understanding to others. And as you can see, these tropes indulge in this kind of exoticizing imagery, right? Of these sumptuous clothes, but also the depravity, right? And particularly the depravity of Muslim men, and the victimization of Muslim women. And you can just see sort of how Muslims are portrayed, and then when you compare it actually to simultaneous processes of prejudice happening in Europe at the time, the cartoon on the left is actually a cartoon of a quote unquote the Jewish mind, and the cartoon on the right is quote unquote a representation of the Arab mind. And what do you notice are the similarities, right? I mean, it's aside from the fact that the cultural behaviors are baked in, right, to the brains of these two subjects. There is these stereotypical imagery about noses or about facial hair, these totally distorted facial features. So there is also there's an absurdity to it, right? There's a humor that they want to kind of utilize to project these stereotypes. And more disturbingly, we think about probably the context which this cartoon of the Jewish mind came from. On the left, this was the heyday of eugenicism, the idea that non-European peoples could be defined by their skull shape, right, and that would explain the way that they behaved, as if they were, incapable of free will or thinking for themselves. And the cartoon on the right is from 2005. It's not that different. So these notions, this type of racism is really it's baked in, and it is not unique to one particular group, right? The same types of operations are at work in both prejudice of anti-Semitism as well as of Islamophobia. Again, this is a modern cartoon, right? It's not engaging in very different notions about the other than the one from the early 20th century. So, when we look at those cartoons, it can be easy to say, well, of course, pulp kind of, cartoons are a pulpy, low way of expressing, current news events, or they're really simplistic. There's no way that those concepts are accepted, right? And fortunately, what I'm here to tell you with this slide is that they are. That especially kind of after the U.S. really became involved in the Middle East, particularly relating to oil resources in the region, relating to the Cold War, the Soviet Union, and certainly after 9/11, there was a real interest in scholarly circles or in highbrow magazine reading circles of why do they hate us, quote unquote, right? I mean, that it's to paraphrase George W. Bush, right? After 9/11, his question or his statement to the American people is that they hate our freedom, right? They being Muslims, they being terrorists, conflated, of course, right? And this narrative had roots in a lot of other thinking that was accepted. So on the left, Bernard Lewis was considered one of the preeminent authorities on Islam in academic circles, right? I mean, not just, he certainly had a very widely selling publishing career in kind of more general publishing, but certainly even within academic circles, he was considered a high authority, right? And he was engaging, right, in this narrative. Why do they hate Westerners, or why are they so angry? These questions that seem simple, right? But you're going to get a particular answer when you ask a particular kind of question. Oops, sorry about that. My bad. In any case, this narrative really lasts, and especially for those of you who remember, particularly the decade after 9/11, when these conversations were on the minds of a lot of people, as the United States launched 2 wars in the Muslim world, in Afghanistan and in Iraq, and also took up the flag of fighting international terrorism through the War on Terror. These tropes about Muslims and the tropes about Islam were dredged up because ultimately, the United States had not really, there was no popular understanding or close engagement with the Muslim world. A lot of it was mediated. So some of you might remember the TV explosion that occurred during the Iranian hostage crisis. This is now studied as a media event in world history because of how present on TV networks coverage of the Iran hostage crisis was. That every night, there'd be a ticker saying how many days it had been since the hostages were taken, that kind of stuff. That these kinds of events pushed the Muslim world into the minds of Americans in a closer way than it had ever been, but it was in a way that was very reactionary to particular events without actually providing a lot of context about how those events came about. So I want to show another video, kind of because, the next part of this is, not just these conversations aren't just happening, in the clouds and in the ivory tower, in magazines. They're not just happening on the back pages of the newspaper and the cartoons, but they're happening through the magic of Hollywood in cinemas, on TV. These are two very old movies, but they have led to this cottage industry of worlds of movies about the Muslim world. But today, really, they're about U.S. war in the Muslim world, right? I mean, these are two movies that both kind of take up Afghanistan as at least a partial topic, or a setting at least, even if they feature no main characters of Afghan origin. How am I doing on time? I think I will actually skip the video clip because I don't want to derail us. Another very important aspect of this is the as part of the demonization of the enemy, specifically the enemy's relationship to women, right? And this is a really sticky topic because especially again after 9/11, there was a really, really concerted effort to frame the war in Afghanistan specifically as a war of women's liberation. That 2 months after the Taliban, after the invasion, the Taliban surrendered. It was a very short actual military conflict war, but the reasoning to stay in the country emerged at that time to say, Laura Bush went on national radio to give a message to Afghan women, saying that the U.S. military mission there, its intention was to create a society that was accepting of women, that freed them from the hijab and from other forms of oppression, right? And these were just things that had been taken for granted, right? That hijab was oppressive, that Islam was oppressive, and that Afghan women were asking really to be saved, right? And this is a problematic narrative in many respects. These two kind of cartoons indicate the historical nature of the enemy's relationship to women in particular, right? That both the Japanese enemy and the Nazi enemy in World War II were seen as threatening, maybe especially at that time, what was seen as the core of the nation's future, right? Women and children. This is certainly present when it comes to Islamophobia and stereotypes about Muslims, that there is a dichotomy created between free Western women who can dress however they want and oppressed Muslim women who have to wear hijab or burqa or niqab. And, this really takes on a life of its own after 9/11, when the war itself the war in Afghanistan itself becomes a kind of crusade to free women. And I kind of wanted to just highlight this instance where a special performance of Eve Ensler's Vagina Monologues in February 2001 involves Oprah actually deveiling a Afghan woman, right? Like standing on stage, reciting a poem, and then an Afghan woman comes out and Oprah takes the veil off of her as a symbolic, action of liberation, right? And it is not, right? It is not the Afghan woman taking off her own burqa, right? I mean, that it is clearly, right, an American woman taking it off for her, right, as this sort of patronizing gesture of active liberation by a Western person. This is a great book if you want to check it out. This is the kind of opening paragraph of it. It's From Victims to Suspects, Muslim Women Since 9/11 by Shakira Hussein. This is another great book, which asks the very basic question, do Muslim women need saving? By Laila Abu Lughod, and it really traces the history of Muslim women's depictions in Europe and the United States in particular, and the savior narrative that has been created around them. I'm going to move on, but I really encourage you to check out those media and also talk about this in the chat if you're interested. Now, a related aspect of Islamophobia that occurs, we've talked about the "why do they hate us" narrative. We've talked about the liberation of women narrative, and this is kind of the maybe kind of most basic or crude way of putting this, right? Of that Islam is actually putting back the clock, right? That all these things, democracy, women's rights, whatever it might be, is encapsulated by this basic fact about Islam and urge of Muslims that they want to actually take us back from the 21st century to the 17th century, and whatever that associates for people going back in time. And of course, it involves this is a key aspect of demonizing the enemy, right? That there is something inherently evil about these people. As we see here, this member of the Taliban in this cartoon is drawing a swastika as the S in the word Afghanistan. So, as we kind of move through these, right? Again, like that, you can see how Muslims are portrayed in this media. It is especially in this one, right? There's a barbaric quality to these people. They look insane, right? Their eyes are popping. There's, and of course there's also this association with violence. That violence is an inherent part of the way that Muslims approach religion or religious freedom. And of course, the fear, ever-present fear in the minds of American politicians, or the people who they stir up, is that this will spread beyond the country itself. So really, right, especially when it came to Afghanistan and the sheltering of Al-Qaeda by the Taliban, there was a fear that Afghanistan would be a base for terrorism across the world. That if the United States did not go in there and stamp out this evil, that it would be projected across the globe, and in the same way that people thought about communism during the Cold War, that Eisenhower's domino effect idea that once Cuba goes communist, then Guatemala will go communist, and all these countries, right? There will be a domino effect. It's the same concept here, and what I like actually about this cartoon so much is that when you think about the Vietnam War and specifically the media crusade that was enacted to justify American involvement there, there are all sorts of honestly hilarious news articles and statements by politicians at that time saying, well, Vietnam is a key exporter of rice to the United States, right? I mean, and it accounts for some of the world's most precious rice and tea exports and things like that, and this resonated for some reason, right? Certainly oil served a similar purpose for the Middle East, but people didn't really know anything about Vietnam, and people didn't really know anything about Afghanistan either. And that the reason that these stereotypes and that this fear was able to fester so easily was that there was almost an information vacuum. There was an information vacuum. It wasn't almost an information vacuum. And it's very, very similar, right? In the same way that people feared, well, if Vietnam goes communist, then all these other Southeast Asian countries will, and then all of Asia will. And here we see this repurposed for the Islamic world, that Afghanistan and Iraq will descend into terrorism, then Palestine will. I mean, actually, in an earlier era, Palestine probably would have been the first domino that people would have thought of. So before I kind of move on, I'm going to just take a very quick break. Does anybody have questions? You're welcome to raise your hand with Zoom or throw them in the chat. I'm just going to also look through the chat really quickly. Okay. Again, feel free to comment in the chat if you do have any questions. So so we've talked about Islamophobia, and we will certainly kind of engage with this topic more during the breakout rooms. But I want to quickly cover a very pervasive stereotype about Afghanistan, and hopefully, again, I had this conflict between whether to do just the media detox today or some 101. I don't want this to be just a purely negative presentation, so I hope that this can also build some knowledge for everybody. That one of the most pervasive stereotypes about Afghanistan is that it is, in some way a graveyard of empires. That large superpowers in world history have time and time again tried to invade this country. Of course, this country didn't exist until 1917, but that there's something inherent about Afghans. And again, we will also kind of deconstruct the idea of who an Afghan is next week. That these Afghans, they just don't want to be ruled by outside powers, that they are so fierce and fiercely independent that they have rebuffed invasions throughout time. And while certainly, in recent history, the British, the Soviet Union, and the United States have encountered serious difficulties when undergoing military occupations of this region. This is simply, a convenient narrative in the way that placing Afghanistan in a particular spot on the globe or talking about Muslims in particular ways are convenient narratives. Now, stereotypes about Afghanistan, as I said kind of earlier, align closely with Islamophobic tropes and have similar life cycles, but there's a unique history of colonial encounters with Afghanistan that have produced unique stereotypes about the country, and particularly this issue about a graveyard of empires. And similarly to Islamophobia, these stereotypes live in a timeless, ahistorical void, and an ignorance that is almost actively encouraged by those with political interests in the country. And in fact, it actually doesn't date to that long ago. I mean, this quote, at the height of British attempts to control Afghanistan and wrest it from any hint of Russian imperial interest, indicates maybe the basis of what we're talking about here, the ways that Europeans have and now Americans have thought about Afghanistan, that they themselves don't possess a history, right? And that is a very convenient statement to make if you want to fill in the gaps with what you think the most convenient narrative is for your own interests might be. But really, the idea of a graveyard of empires doesn't go back that long. It was, the first, there was somebody who did a kind of a media excavation to find the first usage of this term. It was actually in 2001, a couple months after the United States invaded, in a sort of retrospective article talking about the Soviet invasion of the country 20 years earlier at that point. And, what's interesting about this is, although this term came up so recently, it really drew on the experience of British and Soviet occupations of the country. And yet, when we actually look at the historical record, I love this quote: "Far from being a place where empires go to die, the land of Afghanistan was for millennia a place where they thrived and prospered, thanks in part to its strategic location at the crossroads of Asia." Now, when we looked at those maps of Afghanistan earlier in the slideshow, right, South Asia, Central Asia, Muslim world, however you wanted to cut the pie, Afghanistan was always kind of on the margins of those regions. But this is a way of actually centering Afghanistan, right, to think about its history when it came to imperial powers. These are just some of the lasting legacies that Afghanistan has produced to world history, and I don't want to do art analysis currently, but to give you a sense of what what we see on this coin. This is a coin with a Afghan ruler on the kind of front side with Greek writing, and with a Buddha on the reverse side. This is a piece of gold jewelry produced by Central Asian nomads with turquoise, with East Asian imagery. This is a Bodhisattva. Actually, you can see it at the Art Institute for those of you who are in Chicago, in the South Asia section, produced in the region of Gandhara in modern day Afghanistan. This is a page from a Quran produced in the 16th century or the 15th century. I think this is, maybe one of the most fabulous examples. This is a Quran produced with colored paper from Ming China, and again, also from kind of similar time in the 15th, 16th century. These are paintings from Herat, a city in modern day Afghanistan, which at this time when these miniatures were produced was actually seen as the epicenter of Islamic painting. And so we have that basis of artistic innovation over centuries and centuries of time, which is really the majority of Afghanistan's recorded history. And yet, what ends up happening is that the colonial encounter between particularly the British and Afghanistan in the 19th century comes to be the dominant narrative about this country in the Western world. These are paintings that were produced by British artists during the Anglo-Afghan Wars. There were 3 of them in the late 19th century, or throughout the 19th century, actually. And what we see are these barren landscapes where primarily, British subjects are centered, and usually not just centered, but usually suffering at the hands of threatening, gun-toting Afghans in traditional dress with beards. Here the Afghans are barely even present. I mean, I think here on all the way on the left, you can see an Afghan kind of in the far distance with a sword and shield, but mostly, the emotional resonance is meant to be around the British. And what kind of occurs is that these tropes are dredged up almost whole scale, these images of Afghanistan, when the United States first gets involved really seriously in the country through covert operations in the 1980s to resist the Soviet invasion. And these narratives are fundamental to the way that European and, at that point then, Cold War powers were trying to control the country, to encapsulate it into their political interests, and prevent their rivals from controlling it. And really these images drew on a lot of the ideas about Afghans as fighters, as violent people, as inherently opposed to outsiders, and it operated extremely well because there was such an information void that at that point, people in the U.S. could care less about Afghanistan. And since the 80s, the United States has been, at least on and off again, fundamentally involved in Afghanistan. And yet, when we think about where there was any kind of support for a more authentic vision of the country, even institutionally, there were almost no specialists on the country that were utilized when the United States became involved. Most of these people were, quote, repurposed terrorism experts. And really that tells you all that you need to know, that terrorism experts were seen as just as qualified to speak on Afghanistan as on any other issue, because in the minds of most people, the only significant detail about Afghanistan was its alignment with the concept of terrorism, and how that related to 9/11 and to the US role in the 21st century world. So I want to just take a quick break. So I know I kind of went a few minutes over. Maybe we could reconvene here around 7:05. At that point, I will, hopefully we can do kind of a group activity. Feel free to put any questions in the chat. I'm going to take a quick break, but I'll be back in a couple minutes. And we'll be just examining some media for ourselves, getting our hands on some stuff, some movie clips, that kind of thing. And I'll be sharing that information in the chat. So thank you very much for your attention. I appreciate you bearing with me as I droned on, and hopefully, we'll get some more engaging stuff coming in a few minutes. So see you all at 7:05 Central Time. Hey everybody, just gonna give one more minute for folks to return. All right, well, thank you again for your patience. And at this point, I'd like to kind of split you up into breakout rooms so that you can individually maybe discuss some media that we didn't get to during the slideshow, though you are certainly also welcome to use any of the resources that I shared during the presentation. I'm going to share the link to the slideshow as well. But just for now, I'm going to quickly just get a link for the group activity document. So you can access this document, hopefully, let me know if there are any issues, from that link. And what I'd like you to do when you get into your groups is to basically just take one of those links, look at that content, examine it, especially given the lens we were talking about, critical lens towards tropes, stereotypes about the Muslim world, about Afghans, and just discuss it in a maybe smaller group context. And then what we'll do is we'll do that for maybe 15 minutes and then regroup here and do a little bit of a report back discussion. I know, again, I blathered on for a little longer than I had expected. So, I am more than happy to stay a little bit longer in case you have questions or any comments for me. But hopefully we can kind of wrap up maybe 7:35 Central, if that's okay. Again, I think all the discussion questions are in there. I mean, feel free to come up with your own discussion questions. And I'll be kind of cycling through the breakout rooms along with Zach and Selma in case you have any questions for us or need clarifications on any issues. So let's see, we have 77 people. So if I create 10, we'll have 7 to 8 people per. I think that is probably good. All right, if you haven't used a breakout room before, I think it gives you like a 45-second timer. It'll automatically pop you into it. You can also manually go in. And I will see you back maybe at 7:20, 7:25. Have fun. I will be cycling through. And again, there are content warnings on the media in case you want to avoid any in particular. Right. In all rooms. So you should all be on your way at some point. See you soon.
My group, yes, we looked at the photograph Afghan girl, which I think was the National Geographic cover, and most of us were at least familiar with the photograph. And then we discussed, some of the more recent history that has come out from when she was found and hearing more about her perspective and experience being photographed. But we focused our conversation more on just our initial impressions from looking at the photo itself. And we talked about potential stereotypes, the fact that the photo is so narrow, so you don't see the context that she's in, the fact that her clothing is ripped, she appears potentially, dirty, but at the same time, she has a very striking expression, and even the fact that she potentially has Eurocentric features. Is that why people perceived her to be striking, and just talking about all the layers to this photograph, and especially the fact that it seems like it was taken without her consent. So it was a really interesting discussion. I'm not sure if anyone else from the group wants to add more in the chat, but that's what we focused on, and we were able to pull a lot out of it, even though it's just one photograph and not a video or anything.
Yeah, thank you so much. That's a really insightful contribution. And I mean, it is just one photograph, right? But we are bombarded with photographs every day, right? And all of them are maybe, you know, sometimes, especially even if they're on Snapchat, right, they're a few seconds, and it really, as you know, kind of as your comments show, it really pays to just sit with one, and think about all the framing and the appearance of somebody. Yeah, so thank you for sharing. I saw Alyssa's hand up, though. Alyssa, you seem to have lowered your hand, but I'm gonna ask you to unmute if you'd like to share what you're concerned about. Go ahead.
Yeah, thanks for calling on me. My breakout room had a really rich discussion. We didn't end up like going through any of the images. We followed some of the guiding questions. We spent some time talking through like different portrayals of Muslim characters in movies and TV shows, and kind of talked about how there's like negative stereotypes and different tropes usually, but then we shared some alternative shows to watch that are actually written by Muslim people and portraying like real people and real different stories where them being Muslim like isn't the focus of their character. We also spent some time talking about how there's not really a lot of like positive storylines or images, and that really like what, because I was sharing that I'm 26, so 9/11 happened when I was 5 years old, so I really grew up with only kind of hearing about the war, and that was really like my only association with Muslim people. And so we talked about sort of just like challenging that, and then we ended with talking about how there could potentially be a complicated relationship with Afghan families we're working with, since we are American, and you know, the war. We ended with that.
Yeah, thank you so much, Alyssa. Certainly, right, we all have our own, even like, right, generational interactions with the Muslim world and with Afghanistan in particular. And those timelines can really affect how we see the trajectory of US engagement with the Muslim world, as well as just generally the perspective that we can kind of apply to those issues. And yeah, I really appreciate you bringing up those comments. Any other brave volunteers? I also wanted to say, Alyssa, thank you for discussing the kind of ways that you can translate these concepts into meaningful volunteer practices, because I think that you know, that's really the so what of, you know, this workshop series. And I appreciate you you know, really directly broaching that topic. Any other reflections, either on the content, on how this might inform your volunteer experience? Kathy, I think I see.
Okay.
There you go.
I'm her husband, Mario, and we looked at the very first suggested picture, which was.
I think there's different groups.
Okay,
different
and it just showed a picture of Afghan then, and it showed from the 1970s, probably a group of stewardesses, and then Afghan now, when it showed women in burqas being repressed. And so we talked about how you know, in the past, prior to this, there was maybe before a religious fanaticism, there was a more modernization, and now it is maybe taken a step back, and that's what the image was trying to portray. But it took us to talking about, you know, there's people there who tend to be modern and want to do that, and people who are traditional and maybe want to stay traditional. And also that there are people that we've interacted with, there's educated and people who have means, and then people who maybe, especially the more rural people, who maybe they're very happy and comfortable where they are. And the question that came up for us was, I'm hoping you'll address, is that the refugees that are coming, should we be expecting to be seeing? I'm suspecting we're going to see more of the more privileged or more affluent, the more educated people, because how did they become the people that were able to get on a plane and get here? How is it that they became, how that the military found them advantageous to be part of the system. So that's a question I think we have. If you could enlighten us in this about, okay, these are the kind of people from that for their expectations and how we best can help them. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Mario. And I appreciate, I also appreciate your comments on that. That I guess it's a meme. It was a image posted to kind of like a right-wing forum online, and I appreciated your comment about like, right, like it's a really stark. It's an attempt to create a really stark difference, and yet there's no context, right, about those women in the the bottom photo wearing burqas that you have no idea what they're doing or what their lives are or what they're whether they're happy or sad or whatever. It's just the image wants to just speak for itself, right? And really the jarring difference is what the image is really trying to use as the emotional hook into our minds, and especially also that an airplane with the modern trappings, Western dress is very familiar to people who might be seeing that image, right, in this country especially. So yeah, thank you for all those insights. The question that you asked about the composition of the refugees who are coming, I'm sorry to say I don't know exactly, in terms of what cities they're from or what rural areas they're from. I will say that Kabul as the capital, where the airport was, that a lot of the especially a lot of the TV images and videos that we saw of people desperately trying to get on planes, and really the sort of last area where the U.S. Army was before they pulled out. As the capital, it attracts all kinds of Afghans. So I certainly think that Afghans who are able to with means, who were able to get out of the country before that last kind of desperate attempt to get out in the final days of the U.S. Military mission, those people probably were able to get out beforehand. They were able to get on flights, but I would say that honestly, the people who were running for the planes, it's really hard to tell where they might have been from. And in, another aspect of this that is important to remember is that the Taliban's military advance occurred from all sides at the end, and so a lot of people were already refugees when they were in Kabul from their home state or their home city elsewhere in Afghanistan, and they're double, triple refugees when they're getting on that plane. So I can certainly do more research between now and next week to maybe try to give you a better sense of that. But I don't even know whether the U.S. military has conducted a census or anything, or whether they've published that information. But I appreciate the question, and I take your point that would be certainly useful. I'll try my best to gather some resources on that. But thank you, Mario. It is 7:35. I know this is the end of a long work day for a lot of folks. So I want to just say, I'm happy to stay on for a little while longer if anybody has more questions or wants to continue the discussion for a little while longer. But I want to thank you all so much for your time and your participation. I hope that this has been a useful start to the workshop series. Please feel free to email me if you have any questions. I think Zach can probably send out my email to the full group. But yes, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. You're really, you're doing great work by putting in the effort to inform yourselves, because I feel really strongly that it's going to inform your volunteer practices down the road and make Afghans feel much more welcome when they are let off the bases and come to our cities. So thank you again so much, and I hope to see you next week.
Yeah, thank you so much, Krishna, for a great presentation, and thank you all for attending this evening. Again, this is the first of 4 sessions. We're going to be doing the next 3 over the coming 3 weeks. And yes, we will hopefully be upgrading our Zoom. We will be upgrading our Zoom so we can accommodate all of the people who signed up And yes, thank you again to our co-sponsors, NERA, Refugee One, Refugee Action Network, and Girl Forward, and World Relief as well. So yes, thanks again, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks, folks. And Zach, I don't know. I mean, you're welcome to head out if you want. I'm happy to stay for just maybe, I don't know, 10 minutes. Let me see if I can just let people unmute themselves. One of you who are raising your hands, do you want to try just unmuting yourselves to the work? Laura?
Yeah, I can unmute. I'm just going to quickly maybe answer Mario's question, even though he's not on here.
Oh, okay. Go ahead.
Sorry. At least maybe I'll see it on the recording. Yeah, so someone did mention in the chat that the majority of people who are resettling from Afghanistan right now have special immigrant visa status. So this generally means that they had in some way assisted the American military while they were there. Usually that means in the capacity as an interpreter or translator, but that could also mean as like a fixer or other mechanisms of helping the military. So I would say generally families that we're interacting with right now will have had access to education, whether it was rural or urban. Does not mean that they are like fluent in English. It might mean that they are somewhat more accessible to English, but yeah, I would say more likely than not, they had some relationship to the US military while they were in Afghanistan. So hopefully that somewhat answers the question. Not sure if it really does.
Thank you, Lauren. I appreciate that.
I can go next. I guess my question was on a similar line of, so once the refugees are off the bases, like what is the protocol of connecting them with organizations? Is it one organization? Do they get connected out to lots of different organizations? Like, how does this all work, I guess? So that's I'm kind of new to this. I am a teacher, so I do have, a student currently who is from Afghanistan. And so mostly my purpose is just to kind of educate myself a little bit more about the country, the culture. I mean, even though I'm Muslim, I know that it's, it's not a monolith, right? There's a lot of diversity in there. But just the process of refugees when they get off the bases, like how do they get assigned to where they're going to be? And how do they get connected with people who, can translate for them or, help with housing and schooling and just kind of, I don't know, getting their life together.
Yeah, I think I can maybe give the beginning of an answer to that. So there are a number of refugee resettlement agencies in the United States. Are there 9 of them, Lauren? 7 or 9?
I think there's 7 VOLAGs, but then resettlement agencies is a separate thing. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Maybe you could explain better than I could.
Sure. Well, so yeah, the refugee resettlement itself is convoluted, but the short answer is that a resettlement agency for the most part is where these families are initially being connected to a resource. So like pretty much any other refugee, when they first come, that agency is the one who finds them housing, sets up the housing, sets them up with their social security number, gets them set up with public benefits, enrolls the children in school. But usually resettlement services only last for the first 90 days. And at that point, it's kind of up to the resettlement agency if they have the funding outside of federal funds to continue supporting that family. So I know that some resettlement agencies can go all the way up to 9 months, depending on the needs of the family and what funding resources they have. But because of the urgency of this situation, the federal government has actually implemented a few other ways that families can get connected to communities and resettled more quickly. So there's a community sponsorship program, which allows groups of people like private citizens to sponsor a family, and they are the ones then doing everything that a resettlement agency would do. And now, I don't know if this is everywhere, but at least in the state of Illinois, they're also opening up that option of community sponsorship to community-based organizations. So for example, Syrian Community Network as a nonprofit has been asked if we would like to engage in this. We're still talking to the state about that and figuring out if we have the volunteer capacity, but like, I mean, at the most, we'll probably take 2 or 3 families through that. So there's obviously hundreds of families. I do know that the timeline that the federal government is pushing to have everyone off the bases is by mid-February, which is like a month from now. So yeah, we're taking a lot of new solutions at this point that, for better or for worse, at least get people off of the bases and into communities quickly. But yeah, I know, Ashley, you look like you have some more information.
Yeah, can I just add one quick thing?
Yeah.
I just wanted to name, Lauren did a great job explaining it from the refugee perspective, but I want to name for everyone here that right now is an incredibly confusing time for both service providers, the government, and most importantly, these folks who are trying to figure out their status. And so a lot of what your question, a lot of the root of your question also depends on the status that they've been given by the United States government on the base as to what their next step is. And for us as service providers and for you all as community members, I'm from Girl Forward, by the way, sorry, I'm Ashley. It's hard for us to even know, and we are embedded in this system, right? So there are a lot of folks getting a status that's relatively unknown called humanitarian parole right now as they're exiting the bases. And those folks have different pathways to different kinds of services. And so there is also a lot of confusion. So it's okay to be walking through that muddy water with us. And I just also wanted to name that there are not very many people who have all of the answers right now about those experiences, which is why you all are so important as volunteers. And to name Lauren's point, it's so important for us to be continuously working together to think of creative solutions right now, is there are so many people coming with different statuses that we've never had to have this influx in this way. So I just wanted to say thank you all to you all again and add that as well.
If you have a specific question about like connecting that student to resources, you can reach out to me. I'll put my email in the chat. I can't say for sure we will have a referral in mind, but depending on where you're located and the needs, we could try and connect them to something.
I just had one quick question. I used to work, I still work in a high school part-time, but it had a big feed-in from World Relief. And a lot of times I made cultural mistakes that I didn't want to make. And I think I noticed that one of the topics is going to be cultural nuances, maybe. Is that one of them that will be taught? Because that was just real important for me not to make, like, I don't want to do things wrong in somebody's culture, but I didn't know enough because we had people coming from many different countries, but this is one specific area, correct? I mean, it's Afghanistan, correct?
Yeah, so next week's workshop is, I mean, the title is "Who is an Afghan?" and I hope that is a broad enough question that we can really get to all the different types of Afghans that there are, because the word Afghan doesn't really tell us much, and particularly given how diverse the country is. So hopefully, next week we'll really try to do a deep dive into the various languages, religions, community backgrounds of folks from Afghanistan, so that you are confident that if somebody tells you their background, that you'll feel like you have some grasp on what that means, and also how to find kind of more information about that for yourself. So I hope that answers your question. Okay. Judy and Todd,
my question is about, I've heard and read a lot that people have left the bases, before the full processing happens, because they're frustrated, tired of not getting going, and I'm sure there's lots of reasons. So my question is, how how do those people, do they get caught back up in some kind of safety net? Obviously, if you're going through the system, there's a whole path, frustrating as it might be and full of red tape, I'm sure. And so the question is, though, then those people who walked off the bases, what's happening to them? I'm curious, or what you know about how agencies interact with them, or do they not allowed to interact with them, or, you know, what? That's my question.
I want to be mindful that you also are very knowledgeable. Do you have, before I jump
Go
in?
for it. Go for
Okay,
it, please.
cool. So I think there's kind of two things that are happening here. One is that they have family already in the US and they don't really need to wait for a social services agency to be connected with because their family is offering to take care of them. So that's one kind of pathway as to why people are leaving the bases early. Another is that, and this is happening in Chicago right now where SCN is based, is they're finding social service agencies and reaching out to them and self-advocating. And it might not be, it's not a resettlement agency at that point, but like there's Muslim Women's Resource Center in Chicago. And the woman who founded that is from Afghanistan. And I think a decent amount of her staff speak Pashto or Dari. So like they're reaching out to them, and there's nothing that says that a community-based organization cannot help and serve them. So by no means are they like blocked from that. I do think, to Ashley's point earlier about the different kinds of statuses that they have, at this point, I know that there was some legislation passed to maybe make like an exemption from this, but like usually humanitarian parolees are not eligible for public benefits. But I think that they made an exemption for this particular case because they wanted to make sure that these people could access public benefits still. So I think that's really what they're doing now, is kind of, like you said, signing themselves off the base, either going with family and then also maybe still accessing community-based resources, even with the help of family, or just going straight to the community-based resources. But there's no bar for us to then help them at that point.
I had a quick question added to that with when they're looking for housing, is section section 8 housing an option? Sorry, my husband's here. We've actually been working with, you know, a refugee family through ICNA in like the Aurora Naperville area, and we're just kind of flabbergasted with like, how do you get your life back together after all of this? So
yeah,
so section 8 housing, is that an option? Or
that's a great question. I do not know the exact answer for that. I do know that generally there's long wait lists for section 8 housing, so even if they are eligible, it's probably not a solution for right now. Though it might be great to at least get them on that wait list so they have affordable housing for the future. Kathleen, do you know more about that?
Yeah, I was going to jump in. I actually work for HUD, and there definitely are very long wait lists, and that's like a whole separate agency that they would need to connect with. Although usually, you know, if they have a case manager, that would help them start getting linked in with services, but I think that any short term, that's probably not a solution.
Right.
So it, like
we're
we've been working. Go ahead.
Sorry, I apologize. So the problem that we seem to be running into is that this world relief funding is going to run out in maybe 6 weeks. It's a family of 17.
Oh wow.
3 generations, 8 adults, I apologize, 8 adults. And, you know, like, how are they supposed to, they were given a check of $740 for 2 weeks to feed 17 people. And I'm just floored. I just don't know what we're doing. So my next call is going to be Dick Durbin or one of these guys, because this is ridiculous. We've given billions of dollars to world relief in some of these organizations, and I don't think the trickle down is trickling down. So how
That's
are they
very-
supposed to, they half of them don't speak any English, so they really can't even get a job. I mean, we'll be lucky to get them in an Amazon warehouse because that's the only thing that they could probably do. They'll work 25 hours a day and barely even be able to make rent because rent in DuPage County is $2,200 for a 2-bedroom house or apartment, apologize, you know.
Yeah, that's definitely a major issue with refugee resettlement in general, especially in urban areas where rent prices are so high. This is also a very short-term solution, but for example, Syrian Community Network has funding from IDHS to provide rental assistance due to COVID, but we've been told that we can also extend that to recent Afghan arrivals. So it's for 3 months of rent. So again, please email me and hopefully we can at least get them connected with that additional funding. So at least for the next 3 months, they're not having to worry about their rent. But yeah, that's exactly one of the issues that we've been discussing internally is how big these families are, and having affordable housing is nearly impossible at this point.
All right, folks, I am going to log off, but I don't know if Lauren has a wealth of knowledge that she could probably share, but I'm sure also you can email her. Thank you all again for your participation. See you next time, I hope.
Thanks, everyone.
I guess we can just stop the recording.